Welcome to the RHD ITB install. So guys, as you can see, we have the stock manifold off. The fuel rail and injector rail are pulled up out of the side. We are going to be installing the RHD intake manifold. As you can see, we have our stock manifold removed and everything is pulled off in preparation for the install. If you need to have a video on the removal of an intake manifold, there should be enough videos out there to show you how to actually remove it. It's fairly simple, and it's actually the reverse of putting the RHD manifold on. Before we install the actual intake plenum, we're going to set up the vacuum system that goes underneath the intake manifold. You saw in our assembly video that we have these 6 ports threaded in, and they all have a vacuum port underneath. We assembled our vacuum block here, as you can see, and this is what these 6 will connect to. So we have our instructions, gives us a clear and laid out exactly where everything goes so that everything works well. Each one of these will go to a corresponding spot on the block. Our smallest one here will be the vent hose that is off of the valve cover, and our large one here will go to the ICV. So you have a choice. You can eliminate the ICV or you can keep it. Either way, this ties into that vacuum hose, which in turn goes back to the plenum, and you'll have a, where is it? There we go. We have this provided little flange that matches this flange, of course, as you can see. This flange will actually get inserted either into the actual intake plenum or in the hose after the MAF. It is your choice where that goes, but once you place that, then the bottom hose from the ICV plugs into that, and that goes into the after the MAF. So that is up to you where you want to place that. We'll get to that later once we get this situated in that intake manifold into its position. But for now, we are going to route our all our vacuum hoses and get all of this kind of situated in one unit under here, so when we slide it in, it's all one. So your next step is to kind of figure out where you want this distribution block. We want it in reference with the ICV, which is pretty much in the middle of the 4th runner here. So we're gonna put it kind of like this, sitting kind of in that area right there. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna measure each hose, and we're gonna cut it for each length so that we have a perfectly aligned situation. Our vacuum hose is just generic 5/16 hosing from the local auto parts store. You can get it anywhere, and we'll just cut it and put our clamps on and get this situated. So now you can see we have our vacuum lines hooked up to our vacuum ports. Our last one here is the one that gets kind of tricky. So this one comes into this provided T here, and then this T, this side will go with a hose to that barb. This one will go out and will tie into our brake booster line. So we have a line that goes into the brake booster so we can have vacuum. That is where that comes from. So put those fittings on, and we'll get this all set up. I'm gonna cut this a little bit shorter, and then we'll run it into the brake booster once we get to the install part. So once we put the actual valve cover in, once we put the manifold in, we'll hook up the ICV to the ICV hose, and we'll hook up this hose to the brake booster hose. And then of course we'll work with the other ICV hose and show you where to run that one so that it works with this kit. So I'm going to trim this hose, get this all set up, put all of our hose clamps on, and we'll be ready to put it in. So now that we have our vacuum lines in and tightened down, we need to remove the carbon fiber plenum. Everything from here on out right now, all the way up until tuning, we do not need the carbon fiber plenum on the car. I mean on the manifold. We will need access to the throttle position sensor in the back, which will transfer over from the stock throttle body. So when we get to that, you'll need the access to that on the back side. So removing the plenum just makes it easier to handle and finish hooking up all our lines and getting everything kind of situated. So next step is to remove the plenum, and we'll be right back. So our next step, guys, before we install is to put in our throttle position sensor. So this tells the car where the throttle is and tells the ECU what to do, etc. So we've taken off our throttle position sensor off our stock throttle body, and as you can see, the shaft matches the shaft down here, but our shaft is slightly tilted back. So we have to replicate that with this setup. So what we need to do is this plate adjusts. So what we need to do is we need to figure out what's going to replicate that degree backwards. So as you can see, as this throttle opens, that shaft is going to move. Okay? So what we have to do is the same idea here, is this shaft's going to move forward as well, just like that one does. But we need to get the sensor set at the right degree backwards so that it matches this here. So let's get this attached so we can get the throttle bodies installed. We will use the provided hardware to cinch this throttle position sensor down where we kind of replicated it to go. It will, we can always adjust this once we get it on and we start tuning. We can adjust this with these two bolts. We can adjust it to change the idle and our wide open throttle and all that kind of stuff. That can all be adjusted once we get this in. But now that we got it on, now we can set the manifold into its home. So what we'll do to make this easy is, and what I've found is that as you slide this into place, the back stud needs to go on first, and then you can kind of work your way forward with it. But the back one in the very back is the hardest one to get located. But once you do, the whole manifold kind of slips down and it'll slide into place and we will get done. So let's move this in and drop it down. So manifold snaps down just perfect and nice. We have our throttle position sensor on the back. You can re-clip in. We now have our throttle cable from our stock throttle body, which we will thread through here. These pieces broke on mine because they were brittle, but the thing is, they make a billet version of this, which will be really, really nice addition to this. So I've ordered the billet aluminum one so that we can run this throttle cable with a new billet item instead of this, and it fits nicely and will tie in because this will go over top, tie into there, that tightens in there, and boom, you're done. But this is in. Our next step is to bolt it down. Once we bolt it down, then we can drop the injectors in and use our extended hardware that they provided here to bolt our fuel rail down to our intake manifold. But let's get all the bolts attached and we'll move on to the next step. So our next step, now that we have the manifold bolted down, we are going to run our vacuum lines real quick. So since we've connected everything prior to putting the manifold in, the only thing we have to hook up is our main big fitting into our ICV, and our ICV then goes to our brake booster. So it's literally use the T. Let's connect them, and then we're going to be done on the vacuum side. Your next step is to get your beautiful fuel rail in place. So what we're going to do is we're going to drop our fuel rail. Right now our fuel rail is kind of tucked up there. We're going to get it, let me knock it loose here and move it around, and we'll drop our injectors into place and we'll hook everything back up. And as you can see, we'll use our spacers provided right there in that area to bolt this down at the right height so that our injectors seat nicely. So now that you got the injectors put in there and your spacer put on, everything tightened down, you can now go back and hook up all your fuel lines that you disconnected and anything else on this that you disconnected while taking the stock manifold off. Our next main step is to make sure everything's synced up. We're going to hook up our throttle to our throttle cables. We're going to make our adjustment on here and then tighten down our bolts so that we make sure that we have our perfect ratio that matches the stock layout. And once we're done there, we're going to be ready to start the car, guys. So we are almost there. Just a few more things and we'll be ready to start this, and then we'll start tuning it. So let's get to it.